and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, the US President Donald Trump says he blames the leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, for the Russian invasion, accusing him of having responsibility for millions of deaths. The Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, signs bills implementing President Trump's directive that the Gulf of Mexico be renamed the Gulf of America. We ask, why is this significant? And a senior Hamas official says the Palestinian group is prepared to release all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for what they called a serious prisoner swap, and as well as guarantees that Israel will end the war in Gaza. Hello and welcome to the program. The US President Donald Trump has taken a fresh swipe at the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, stating that he and the Russian President Vladimir Putin share the blame for starting the war. Well, that statement came just a day after a Russian attack killed 35 people in the Ukrainian city of Sumy.
But that's a war that should have never been allowed to start, and Biden could have stopped it, and Zelenskyy could have stopped it, and Putin should have never started it. Everybody's to blame.
Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak to Tobias Ellwood, former UK Defence Minister, who joins us now from the south of England. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, sir. Do you think President Zelenskyy should shoulder any of the blame for the war in his country?
No, not at all. And it's really quite shocking to hear the American president choose to recalibrate the blame here, to actually get us to perhaps unpick what has happened and reinterpret it in a different way. And the constant domestic agenda that Trump is following to try and blame his predecessor, rather than recognizing that this was a full-scale invasion by Putin, by Russia. We saw the buildup of the troops 3 years ago when Putin absolutely said, no, I'm not going to attack, I'm not going to cross the borders and so forth. And then we saw this unfold in slow time. The whole of Europe has lived and breathed this. And now we're witnessing Trump trying to convince us that absolutely none of that happened, that in fact it is Zelenskyy, it's the Ukrainians to blame. And this is very, very worrying indeed. It shows that there's a bigger picture at play here. There's a bigger agenda that President Trump is following to try and bring President Putin in from the cold. And it shows just how divided, I'm afraid, the transatlantic view is on what to do next as instability increases. America clearly is dialing back from its interests in Europe, blaming Zelenskyy, Ukraine, for what's going on here, wanting to withdraw, but absolutely ignoring where President Putin will take this. It's a very, very dangerous time indeed for Europeans as we see Trump pursuing this very, very worrying agenda indeed.
Just to be fair on what the president said, I mean, he did say that President Putin and President Biden were also to blame. In fact, I think he said President Putin was more to blame than President Zelenskyy. So, I mean, he didn't exactly pin the blame solely on the Ukrainian leader.
But how can there be any misinterpretation as to what the Russian troops did? They invaded another sovereign state, another democracy in Europe. And I have to say that NATO, that is the biggest, largest, most advanced, most capable international security organization in the world, stood idly by whilst something on its doorstep then inflamed itself. We could have actually put this out, there's no doubt about it, straight away. But we had this constant international debate. Should we or shouldn't we arm Ukrainians? Will we spook Putin into using nuclear weapons? We lack that Cold War statecraft, if you like, that ability to look at our adversary in the eye, conscious of the escalatory ladder, but actually to stand up to the aggressor. And what President Trump is inviting us to do today is actually join in appeasing President Putin. I was saying, well, actually, we should just allow the bully to continue. And this is where Trump has got it so wrong. Because if you did have some sort of peace deal today, that everybody went back and the ceasefire was in place, President Putin will simply use the time to rearm, to regroup, and advance even further, because that is what his long-term vision is greater influence over Eastern Europe.
Yeah, we're just hearing that, in fact, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is in Odessa today. He's been visiting, saying there that NATO support for Ukraine is unwavering. I mean, that's going to be an important morale boost, isn't it? Because those comments by President Trump with regards to apportioning blame for the conflict came after one of the most devastating attacks of this whole war, the attack in Sumy.
Yes, and a great example of what Putin is actually doing. He's actually taking the fight away from the front line and trying to attack the Ukrainian civilian population themselves, the infrastructure that Ukraine depends upon. That's what Putin is targeting. That breaches international laws. It goes against the Geneva Conventions and so forth. But that's exactly what Putin is allowed to do with impunity. And usually it is America, the leader of the West, that stands up to wrongdoing across the world. And yet here we have, bizarrely, President Trump actually courting a relationship with our adversary, and also at the same time trying to then label President Zelenskyy as the enemy. At one point, he switched off sharing of critical intelligence with Ukraine, and also holding back weapon systems too. In some degrees, Trump is correct that had Biden and others, the international community, stepped up much faster, we certainly could have pushed back Russia in quick time. That didn't happen. As I mentioned, there's the hesitance, the risk averseness, if you like, in dealing with a nuclear power. That, I'm afraid, simply gave Putin more confidence. But he's now even more encouraged to continue his attacks on Ukraine because he feels he's got America's back.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps this approach of blaming Ukraine for being invaded by Russia, I mean, I just want to understand it a bit better. I mean, do you think there is a strategy here? I mean, could this be part of a negotiating technique that will become clear and make better sense perhaps as the negotiations continue? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's such an important question because when you speak to Republicans, you speak to Americans, they say, don't listen to the rhetoric. So there's something behind this. There is a strategy. He's going to knock heads together. It's the art of the deal and so forth. No, there is something bigger going on, which is simply this is all about what is it best in America's interests. And Trump views the world in a very different light than his predecessors that had some sort of duty, if you like, to uphold and defend the international rules-based order. That's gone. Trump's not interested in any of that at all. What Trump wants to do is whatever is in America's interest, including deals with adversaries. So friendships, allies, and so forth, the traditional relationships that we've seen between America and Europe, they're gone. They're completely gone. This is now about a world in somewhat chaos. It's where big beasts roam and each have their spheres of influence. And Trump has no interest in taking any views on European security. From that perspective, absolutely right. And Trump was correct on this point too. For some time, we should have been investing more in our own security. That said, whenever America has asked for support, whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan, actually nations didn't hesitate, regardless of what their defense budgets were. But certainly, there's now a requirement to recognize that America is dialing back and Europe's interest in looking after its own security must increase.
Yeah, I mean, we're now 6 weeks on from that famous Oval Office encounter. I mean, it needs no further explanation. And just going back to why President Trump might now be lashing out once again at the Ukrainian leader in terms of trying to understand the backstory and the logic, the rationale for it. Could he be angered at the lack of progress on the minerals deal? Because as you've been saying, he's got very much America's interests, first and foremost on his list of priorities, and that's understandable since he leads the country. But do you think he's angered that minerals deal isn't perhaps shaping up as quickly as he'd like it to?
I have to say, I think this minerals deal was a complete red herring. The only minerals deal that actually Trump is interested in is potentially one with Russia. Make it clear, and I've spoken to some Ukrainian MPs about this. There is a lot of mineral wealth in Ukraine, but a lot of it is now in parts of the country which are underneath ordnance, underneath munitions and so forth, unexploded bombs. So, and also Ukraine went through a long period, decades, where it was run by oligarchs And their vision was simply to make more money. The idea that they would miss an opportunity to dig down in the ground, to take advantage of that mineral wealth, it means that any extraction today would be very, very costly indeed. There'll be no minerals deal that is likely to come out anytime soon. And the idea somehow that was put forward, oh, well, if you have American workers, contractors operating in Ukraine, that will provide some sort of security. You know, I worked in, visited Afghanistan, where I bumped into some contractors there looking at exploring mineral wealth and so forth. As soon as the bombs started dropping, they were out of there. So this is all, as I think, smoke and mirrors. So the fact that there is a higher agenda here of America seeking to extract itself from any support, any interest for Ukraine, but building a relationship, bizarrely, with our adversary, with our Cold War adversary, with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, people we've spoken to have also pointed out the fact that once you've set up the mining infrastructure and, you know, you've got your American geologists and mineral experts in place, I mean, we're talking about several years down the line before any of that extraction from the earth is translated into money for America, aren't we?
Completely, which is why I think we should stop even sort of talking about it or taking it seriously. I go back to the point here. What is Putin's vision? What's his objective? He sees Ukraine as a territory that ultimately is part of Russian history, and to some degree, there's a little bit of truth in that. Kiev Rus, for example, is very much in the 10th century, 9th, 10th century, very much all part of this Russian motherland. But today, Ukraine is accepted by the international community as a standalone state where Putin has invaded. And from that perspective, it is absolutely right, the international communities to support Ukraine in its hour of need. And the big question now is whether we have the political will. We have the military capability in Europe to stand up to Russia. There's no doubt about it. It's whether we have the political collective will. I'm actually pleased that Britain has stepped forward with this coalition of the willing, this plan B, if you like, because as more time progresses, less and less respect is given to any deal Trump might come forward with. Don't forget, he actually promised to solve this in the 24 hours of his inauguration. Clearly, that hasn't happened. Nothing's advancing forward very quickly. No chance of any ceasefire. Both sides are still at it on the front line. We're in a very difficult place here, but Europe needs to recognize it must start looking after its own security.
Yeah, I mean, we're 85 days into this second Trump administration. The talks with Russia began in February. I mean, has there been any progress? I mean, do you think anything has come out of those talks up until this point that's worth noting?
No, I think quite the opposite. And this is perhaps to the frustration of Trump. I think he thought he yielded this power, the might of America, to knock these heads together. But Putin is a wily operator. I mean, he's dealt with presidents such as Trump in the past. He knows exactly what's best for Russia's interests, for his own interests. And he's not going to play along with Trump. If he doesn't like what Trump is doing, then he will pursue something very, very different indeed. But his objective, as I stress, in taking Ukraine and beyond, I should stress, these other countries that are in the Baltic region, that's what he actually wants to do, regardless what Trump is up to. He's not scared of Trump at all, but he enjoys having Trump's blessing, which is, again, is bizarre. We, as an international community, need to stand firm, not be spooked by any of this, and continue supporting Ukraine. Otherwise, I'm afraid it won't simply end there. European security will continue to be challenged, as will the European economy as well.
One thing that stood out for me in what President Trump said last night, and we listened to a clip before we crossed you, is that President Trump said that millions of people were dead because of 3 people. I mean, in terms of my understanding of the death toll, it's in Ukraine, we're not in the millions, are we? We're far from that number.
No, and the numbers are high, and it certainly is concerning, the loss of life on the front line. But again, Trump tries to use these numbers to say, let me come in and stop all this, not realizing that there is no depth, I think, as you've implied in your previous questions. What is on the table? What is America offering that's going to offer long-term peace? What is the strategy? There is nothing there. All he wants is to be able to confirm he has some sort of deal. The fact that he's even let out that he is seeking a Nobel Peace Prize shows he's not got his eye on the ball of what is best for Europeans' interests. This is all about Donald Trump himself. And the fact that he weaves in this narrative to blame the previous administration shows that he's constantly looking at one thing, which is his own polling numbers in the United States, and how best to confirm and advance the current administration's cause to hopefully stay in power. That is what focuses Trump's minds and his team.
President Zelensky is urging President Trump to visit his country. He made that appeal once again on Sunday on US television. That would change his perspective, wouldn't it? Do you think it's likely to happen?
Well, it's interesting who is advising Trump that he believes that his advance on global tariffs, that his views on European security, or perhaps getting closer to Putin, is in America's long-term interests. I say this very clearly, that Britain and America, seen from the same song sheet, is so important and has benefits on both sides. So were President Trump to visit Ukraine and realize that actually the folly of somehow getting closer to Putin is not in even America's best interests, that might change things considerably. But as things stand at the moment, I can't see that happening. But I would encourage 100% that President Trump to visit Ukraine and to see for himself exactly the sacrifice that's being made by the Ukrainian people, what they're up against, how Russia is dealing with warfare itself and breaking all the international rules, and has no intention to stop.
We'll certainly suggest it to people we speak to in the Trump administration from here on after, that he does go and see it. And perhaps seeing will be it will be a case of seeing is believing. But where do you think this leaves the British government? I mean, Sir Keir Starmer's in a tricky position, isn't he, having to navigate this one? He's quite a new prime minister. He's only been in the job less than a year, and he's having to deal with a very unpredictable second-term President Donald Trump, who doesn't seem to be at all aligned, as we've been saying, on very key geopolitical issues such as the war in Ukraine. How's he doing, do you think?
Well, I have to say, I can't fault him at the moment. This is a very difficult act. And I touched on the importance of this transatlantic relationship, not least the special relationship, as we call it, this bond between the United States and Britain. And I think he's done well to avoid the obvious criticism, to say the sort of things that I've been saying, which perhaps could be interpreted the wrong way. So he stayed well back of that, but recognizing also that there needs to be this plan B. It was America that has triggered Britain and France to look at an alternative plan, to create this coalition of the willing. And I'm very pleased that Britain has now perhaps rekindled the sense of European leadership. Dare I say that we've been off reservation for the last 5 or 6 years internationally because of Brexit. And here we are actually forming the sort of security arrangements that absolutely are needed for Europe at the moment. We've even got, as we speak today, a summit on the future of Sudan, and being led, co-chaired by Britain and the European Union. This is Britain stepping forward, using its connectivity, its convening power to bring the stakeholders around the table, to recognize the dangers that are coming over the hill, but also crafting a plan of how we move forward. I think that's exactly what Britain has done in the past, and we're starting to do it again. And as I say, I think it's exactly what any prime minister should be doing at this point.
Yeah, so the UK divorced from Europe and sort of straying from the United States. I mean, you'd have thought the UK was looking and feeling somewhat vulnerable at this particular moment on the world stage, but you're saying, in fact, it's turning everything into a series of opportunities here.
I think so. We absolutely want to keep that relationship with America going. We've an awful lot of back channels. They remain our closest security ally. We're part of that, the Five Eyes community, certainly that NATO relationship as well. We've actually got senior American generals embedded in our military construct here in the UK. Ultimately, though, President Trump has chosen a different interpretation of America's place in the world at this moment. And that does raise lots of questions, as we've just been discussing. Who fills the void? Who actually steps into that vacuum? And I'm pleased that that's exactly what Britain is doing. And it's not a moment too late, given the fact that I say there's the resurgent Russia seeking to take advantage of perhaps this increasingly chaotic global order that we're now witnessing.
Just lastly, and briefly, if you will, I mean, one of the things that President Trump said last night again, he said, when you start a war, you've got to know that you can win the war. Just circling back to our conversation right at the beginning of this interview, I mean, is there anything you think President Zelenskyy could have and should have done to prevent this war?
Nothing. I think Putin was determined to attack. And let's just confirm that sentence that you just read out absolutely applies to Putin as well. He started this war hoping to take all of Ukraine, just as he did in 68 with Czechoslovakia or in Hungary in 56, and he's not succeeded. And the more we stand with Ukraine, the more we can prevent that actually from ever happening.
Okay, Tobias Ellwood, former UK Defence Minister, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Well, let's get another opinion. We can speak to Greg Swenson, the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed for being with us here once again, Mr. Swenson. We were just talking there to the former British Defence Secretary Tobias Ellwood, and I put this question to him after we listened to a clip of President Trump partially blaming President Zelenskyy for the invasion of his own country by Russia. Let me put the same question to you. Should, in your opinion, President Zelenskyy shoulder any of the blame for the war in Ukraine?
So, Tom, it's a great question. And I think the answer is yes, with some caveats, right? You know, he has been put in a really difficult position. He has bravely fought off the Russian invasion in February of 2022, the invasion of Kyiv. And I think the Ukrainian people should be very proud of that. But in 18 months ago, his leading military, basically the general who's the equivalent of the U.S. chiefs of staff or joint chiefs of staff, he approached Zelenskyy and said the same thing that Mark Milley said to Joe Biden. Mark Milley, the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, went to Biden and said, again, the Ukrainians bravely fought off and defended Kyiv. But this war is at a point where it's not winnable. It's a stalemate, and we should negotiate now. Now, that was 18 months ago, probably more like 20 months ago at this point. And so, you know, in that sense, I think Zelenskyy does deserve some of the blame because he was approached by his senior military advisor, basically the chief of the Ukrainian military, and was told the same thing that Joe Biden was told, that this war is a stalemate. It's not winnable. Now is the time to negotiate. And he failed to do that. He fired that minister. And I apologize, I can't remember his name, and I probably couldn't pronounce it anyway. So, and Biden did the same thing. He didn't fire Mark Milley, but he just ignored him. And so I think it's not really productive right now to just constantly blame Putin. I agree. Putin is the bad guy here. He is the loose cannon. He's the one who's delayed the ceasefire. And I think, you know, that's the great question mark right now. But I think provoking him is just going to be counterproductive at this point in the situation. The time for deterrence was in 2021 and early 22, and it's too late for deterrence.
It is, and we're a few years into this war now, and hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, not the millions that President Trump spoke about. But I mean, we have to ask ourselves, this peace process is underway. The Trump administration has reached out to Moscow, and yet on Sunday, Russia carried out a devastating attack on the city of Sumy in northern Ukraine, killing 35 people, most of them civilians. I mean, who's not being serious about peace here?
Yeah, I think Putin is not being serious about peace, and it's really starting to annoy President Trump. And President Trump has authorized the shipments of F-16s and other lethal equipment. A number of U.S. military cargo planes have landed at the U.S. Air Base in Poland in the last few weeks. So there is an understanding that the best place, you know, the the best position to be in terms of negotiating is not just letting Putin run over Ukraine in the spring offensive. So, I think Putin or the Russians are confident about the spring offensive. That's why the U.S. is quietly moving some equipment there to help Ukraine. But again, calling out Putin at this point, it's the time to do that. And I'm sure most of the West was calling him out before he invaded, but perhaps didn't take him seriously enough. So I think the time for peace through strength and deterrence was in, again, before the invasion. President Trump was very aggressive against Putin in the first term, sending Javelin missiles and other lethal materials to Kyiv after Obama and Biden were sending, helmets and ready-to-eat meals or blankets to a U.S. airbase in Poland. That he called Putin out for killing his own people in 1999. To win the election. 3 presidents before Trump refused to do that, even though they knew that was true and the CIA knew it was true. He pulled out of the medium-range missile treaty. He put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And then, of course, Biden took off the sanctions when he took office in early 21. So this is a president who's shown how to do deterrence and how to do peace through strength. Unfortunately, it's not the right time for that. He just wants to end the war. He doesn't want any more body bags. So he is an anti-war president. He wants peace. Unfortunately, there's going to be some unhappy negotiations. And I just wish that Putin would finally, understand that there's no outcome here that doesn't include high casualties for the Russians too. Unfortunately, he doesn't have to really run for re-election. There are no elections, arguably. And of course, he doesn't care how many of his young men and women are killed. So we're dealing with a difficult adversary right now. And I think the consensus would be very much against Putin. But the problem is we're trying to get to the peace negotiations right now, and it just might not be productive.
I mean, the messages we heard from campaign President Trump were twofold on Ukraine. One, this war would never have started if he'd been in the White House in 2022. Well, we don't know if that can be proven right or wrong, because we can't bring about the alternative scenario. But what we also know he said on the campaign trail was that he could fix this with a telephone call. 24 hours after that call took place, there would be no more war. I mean, do you think he's realizing that this is an awful lot more difficult and a lot more complicated than he had perhaps imagined it would be?
Yes, of course, Tom. And, he knows that. And again, the wild card here is Putin. I mean, Zelenskyy has had his wild card moments, notably in the Oval Office when he flipped 3 times in 1 week on the minerals deal. But other than that, it's we've got Zelenskyy, or the president has got Zelenskyy to the peace table. And it's Putin that's the wild card. So yeah, it's probably frustrating for President Trump. Again, he just wants to end this thing. Perhaps saying it could happen in 24 hours. That was a bit of hyperbole. That's okay. He's a confident president. He's an alpha male. He thought he could get this done. He's probably right that it never would have happened, in 2022 if he was president, because none of these wars started while he was president in his first term, going back to peace through strength and deterrence. And that's not something the Biden administration embraced, nor did the Europeans.
But why do you think he's lashing out at Ukraine at this particular moment? I mean, it's not the Ukrainians that are stalling, as far as I can see. I mean, the Ukrainians have said they're ready for peace. They've played ball, I think it's fair to say, from the Trump administration's point of view. I mean, there's another party that's not playing ball here, and it does seem to be Russia, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agreed. I think it is Russia, but I do think there's some frustrations. I think when Zelenskyy comes out and says things that are critical of J.D. Vance or the president, they're going to push back on that because those comments are also not productive at this time. So, the time for that is a quiet phone call and not in social media or in a public forum. So I think the president is frustrated with that. And I think the things that he said specifically about Vice President Vance were really unhelpful. And I don't think that's, we're talking about a very delicate moment in this. And the alternative is all out war. If the argument is we, the West, need to beat Russia or beat Putin, because if we don't, he's going to keep going, or we're not going to have that kind of deterrence. It'll enable bad behavior. Well, that's fine. It's a great conceptual argument, but I haven't seen anybody in Western Europe agree to send soldiers to Ukraine. I missed Tobias's comment, and Tobias is a friend of mine, but we just disagree on this particular issue. So, I don't think there's a real understanding, or better put, I don't think there's any interest in boots on the ground in the West. And so the only alternative is to negotiate. Unfortunately, that's going to require some cooperation from Putin, and we're not getting it right now. It's very frustrating for all.
There is another scenario, which is that, with the right equipment, with the right munitions and the right level of support, and some of that's got to be moral support as well, I'd have thought, the Ukrainians have proven that not only can they prevent Russia from capturing Kyiv, they can go far further than that, and they can actually take some territory from Russia themselves. So, isn't there, the Russian threat, if they can be staved off by a much smaller country like Ukraine, isn't there an argument that actually if the collective West throws their support behind Ukraine, actually Ukraine can achieve a huge amount, that it doesn't turn into World War III?
Tom, I think that is a valid scenario. And if there was a massive commitment from the West, from the U.S. and the West, and I don't think that's likely, but I also think that it would result in a lot more death. And the problem here is, even with better equipment, even with even properly armed, the Ukrainians just don't have enough people. And again, Putin is willing to lose as many as it takes, as many Russians and North Koreans as it takes. That's just cannon fodder. And so that's the problem here is, I would argue that the Ukrainians are underarmed compared to the Russians, who've basically turned their economy into a war machine. But I do think that they have another advantage, as sad as it is, that they have many more people. And so that kind of scenario, while valid, is I think would be a real disaster, and unless it's the only option, and I'm not sure we're there yet.
Yeah, but to be fair on the Ukrainians, they're not just fighting Russians; they're fighting Iranian munitions. It would appear some Chinese soldiers, and a good number of North Korean soldiers as well. These are all traditional adversaries of the collective West.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we have to look back and learn some lessons here. And one is that both the Europeans and the United States are funding both sides of this war, okay, by Joe Biden, by basically funding $60 billion or so in dollars for the regime in Iran, who's sending drones to Russia, and at the same time helping with, sending $100 billion or whatever it was to Ukraine. So the U.S. was funding both sides. The Europeans have recently, 2024, long after the invasion, bought $22 billion of oil, gas, and coal from Russia. That's going right into Putin's pocket, or right into the military's pocket. And so, this is a really difficult spot to be in. And I'm just confused at why, with all these. I don't want to pick on net zero. That's a different topic for a different day. But this obsession with climate, and yet, to a great degree, putting a lot of pressure on European economies, and reducing their ability to develop their defense and security capabilities, and at the same time they're buying fossil fuels from Russia. So this is difficult. Both the U.S. and Western Europe are funding both sides of this war. It would be better to end it peacefully. I hope that's the outcome. That's what the president wants, and I'm sure it's very frustrating for him to have this thing continue.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much. Great to have your opinions. Greg Swenson, Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you. Good to be here.
In other news, Florida has become the first U.S. state to officially recognize the name change for the Gulf of Mexico. Well, the state will now officially refer to that body of water as the Gulf of America. Well, this move follows a directive from the US President Donald Trump. Well, the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed two bills, one that updates state laws with the new name, and the other which directs state agencies to revise all official maps and geographic materials. Well, Florida schools will also be following suit. Starting from the 1st of July, any new instructional materials adopted or purchased must reflect that name change, the Gulf of America. Well, Republicans, including the state president, Ben Albatron, celebrated the signing. Albatron said that he was proud of the move, calling it an example of American exceptionalism. While Senator Joe Grutters filed the Senate version on academic materials, he thanked President Donald Trump and DeSantis for signing that bill. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Angie Wong, a Republican committee member and Republican strategist, who joins us now from Miami. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. The Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, has signed these bills now, changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. I mean, is that significant, would you say?
Well, absolutely. It's following a federal directive from President Trump to federalize that name. And it seems as though state by state, this is happening. The first to do it would be Florida. And Ron DeSantis is playing the political game. He wants to be part of the Trump administration. He now knows that his future has to be in line with the Trump administration. And so do the Florida State House reps, which passed these two bills 28-9. So it's a very small symbolic thing, but a big win for America and certainly a big win for President Trump today.
Now, I was doing a little bit of research, going back to some history books before I crossed to you. And that name, the Gulf of Mexico, has been on world maps since, I think, 1550, which is really going back a very long way. And of course, as you say, the Sunshine State becoming the first state to officially recognize it at a local or state level. I mean, do you think people there in Florida have felt very strongly about this for some time?
Well, I'm not really sure about that, but I certainly think that President Trump has felt very, very surely about naming it the Gulf of America. And quite honestly, it surrounds our southern states. So it makes perfect sense. It is symbolic, but at the same time, when you federalize it and when Florida passed it, it changes all the school textbooks. It changes the signs. It changes the maps. Even Google Map, which is a big authoritative here in the U.S., it is certainly, it's now reflected on Google Maps. So, these are the symbolisms of when there's an America First policy being taken place. And it's going to be these details that is going to drive us forward, that we're going to be an American agenda, American First policies surrounding America. And I think that's what President Trump wants to do. Again, highly symbolic, doesn't really change the way we live here, but it is a little bit of patriotism.
Okay, so it's a little bit more symbolic than anything else, as you're saying. And there are people on the other side of the aisle, and they're saying, there are quite a lot more important things to be discussing. And this is a distraction from much more pressing issues rather than symbolic issues. How would you counter that?
Well, you don't counter it. I mean, this was a very easy vote, right? I mean, if they're in the middle of a legislative session, this is an easy vote to take. But also, I'm sure President Trump and his supporters, they want to see who was on his side in Florida. They want to see who was pro-Trump versus not pro-Trump. And that is something that's definitely dividing Florida as we speak, as we roll into a governor's race later on this year. So I think all of these things kind of just align with President Trump. We hope that other states will follow. We hope Texas will be the next one to go. Eventually, hopefully, California will also adapt the same measures. One by one, these things happen. And earlier, I think it was last month, AP did not adapt to the name Gulf of America, and they were taken to court because they weren't allowed to come into the White House press room because they wouldn't adapt to that name. So all of these are just like small little power punches, but it does show that, hey, are you on Team Trump or are you not? And we need to know who you are. I think that's what this exercise is about.
I mean, do you have to be on Team Trump and agree with everything that President Trump says? I mean, wouldn't it be more healthy for the sake of democracy to be in a team where people were allowed to, veer from the party line on certain issues?
Well, certainly. I mean, this is not a cult, right? This is not like you have to be 100% completely totalitarianism to Trump. But I will tell you, there is a divide in this country, and Trump wants to know early on who's on my team, who's not on my team. And these are some of the things that come around. Well, a very simple exercise of, do you believe in the Gulf of America? Well, why wouldn't you believe in the Gulf of America? And I think those are questions that, have to be answered. And they're all nuanced, but it does reflect your own personal philosophy. Are you going to help Trump, or are you going to hinder Trump? And I think these are the small little exercises that we're seeing right now. But again, I don't agree with everything the Trump team does, but I am, very much for my president, and I want to see him succeed. And I would love to see an America First policy taking place over the next 4 years and hopefully beyond that.
Going back to the example of the Associated Press, their journalists have found themselves unable to enter certain press conferences, media events, notably in the Oval Office. We had a case of a reporter being barred from the Oval Office on Monday, just because, as you say, they're standing by their style guide, which is Gulf of Mexico, not Gulf of America. I mean, some would say this is an affront to freedom of expression, and that the Associated Press, if it has a style guide, some countries say Myanmar, other outlets say Burma. Why shouldn't a press agency be allowed to call a stretch of water what it wants to?
Well, in the U.S. anyway, and U.S. publications, this was an executive order by the president to federalize this particular name change. So if the Associated Press does not want to abide by that, well, maybe outside of the U.S. in their publications, they can call it other things. But if they don't call the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America here in the U.S., well, then they're not playing by the executive order. They're actually challenging it, which is what they did. They brought it up to the higher courts to make sure that they were allowed back into the press room, but calling it something else. Now, obviously, this is a tit for tat. They're allowed into the press room. They're going to get a little bit of slack for it. But it is an executive order, and hopefully our press will follow the law.
The Guardian newspaper, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and for the benefit of our viewers, it does have a left-leaning standpoint. They have an opinion piece which reads as follows. This is about Donald Trump's wide-ranging effort to control the media, it says, and interfere with the flow of accurate information. I was wondering if that sort of line of argument is one that is being used in the United States as well. President Trump wants to own the narrative and control the media. Are people saying things like that there?
It certainly feels that way. A lot of our media feels much more controlled than when I was a newspaper girl back in the day. Look, this is the president of fake news, fake news, fake news. He's gone pretty much his entire life having to deal with the press and deal with tabloids. And the Guardian News, as much as I respect it, does have a bit of a tabloid aspect to it these days, which I find very entertaining. Here's the problem, right? You do have to report the news, and you do have to have your sources, and you have to use the word allegedly when you don't know, etc. Those are the journalism guidelines. I think that's what he's asking for. He's just saying, just report the news as is without the activism. And what we're seeing more and more here in the US and perhaps overseas to our friends in the UK is that there are more activists than there are journalists in the newsroom. And that's what we want to eradicate, because we just want some pure news, just so that you and I can make informed decisions every day based on real facts.
Sure, but that's not unique to the left of the political spectrum, is it? There are quite a few outlets, I would say a growing number in the United States. A couple of names spring to mind that peddle opinions on at the other end of the political spectrum, aren't there?
Yeah, and that's a real war that we're facing in modern times, right? Because the media is owned, and given social media on top of that, it echoes things that may or may not be true. And what is the old marketing saying? You see it 7 times and it becomes true. I think that's what we're battling all the time. I mean, unless you're media literacy and unless you have time to actually deep dive into that story and fact check, you don't know. You're just regurgitating things that you read online. And I think that's a lot of the problems. And unfortunately, there are companies, especially marketing and branding companies, that have monetized on this, pushing out fake news and echoing it to the point where it moves markets and it moves human behavior, and it affects all of us. So I think that is something that we have to be very, very careful of. And, it's who has the time other than to read the headlines at a few paragraphs these days, right? So, all of us, we all fall into this, and, every single country, I think, is kind of looking at this going, well, how do we get back just to straight reporting, straight journalism? It's a very difficult thing, not just for the US, but certainly it is a problem here.
Just going back to the Gulf of America or Mexico, whichever side you want to see it from, Sunday marks a pretty unfortunate anniversary, in fact, for that stretch of water. The 15th anniversary of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. Is that devastating incident going to be known, do you think, from now on as the Gulf of America oil spill? Or do you think that perhaps people will be a little selective and decide that that's perhaps not on brand?
Well, I think the history books has recorded it as the Gulf of Mexico spill, and it was a very unfortunate event. And I do hope that the president acknowledges, all the devastation from that. Ultimately, the books were rewritten very, very recently. The textbooks will reflect that, and it will reflect the executive order that was put out by President Trump, and then Florida being the first state to adopt the new name. So I think all of that doesn't erase history, it doesn't erase what's happened. It just moves us forward in a more America positive light. And that's what we're hoping, right? We're not trying to really cause too much rift with this. We just want to show our dominance. This is the Renaissance for America. And that's what we're hoping to see over the next 4 years in every single industry. Everything that we do, every budget line item is America first.
Does that perhaps threaten relations with Mexico? I mean, do you see this? It's hardly going to help, is it? Ties between Washington and Mexico City?
We haven't heard anything from the Mexican president regarding the name change from Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. If anything, they should speak up. But I don't think anything has been said, not to my knowledge anyway. They haven't made an uproar, and I don't think they're changing their textbooks either. So we may have to live with two names. It may be in brackets in Mexican textbooks. Who knows? But all we know is we have to make these small changes moving forward, because that's the only way we're going to start changing the perception of the U.S. and where we are in the place of the world. I mean, we want to be respected, and what better way of putting our logo everywhere, right? So I think this is a great branding exercise. It's a very, very small symbolic thing, but big for Americans and big for President Trump.
On a more on a slightly different note and a serious note, you've taken to X, or Twitter as it used to be known, in the last 24 hours or so, talking about racism. And I'm just wondering what prompted you to do that. Is there a specific incident, or are you noticing a change in the climate in Florida or more broadly across the US?
Well, I mean, most recently, there's been a lot of targeting of Asian Americans, and especially those of Chinese descent, mainly because of the trade wars that have been stirring up between the US and China. And we're seeing a lot more racial slurs, and even to the point of doxing, which is both against the law. Here's what I have a problem with. We have protections for online harassment and online racial slurs, et cetera. But if these same things, these same incidents were to happen offline, well, those would be crimes. You could get arrested for that. But because we protect our social media companies a lot more than we do our citizens, they get away with it all the time. There's a blanket get out of jail free card in that. So that's what we're trying to change here. I'd like to just note that, we are in changing times. Our own laws on the books don't reflect always what is happening online. And I think those are things that I would like to see changed in this incoming administration, or rather this current administration, and also with our new Congress, is to really address our modern day problems, especially with online harassment, doxing, and any of the things, again, that if these things were to occur offline, people would be in jail by now.
Have you fallen victim to that yourself, Angie? I mean, have people been making racially unpleasant comments to you? What can you tell us?
Yeah, multiple times. In fact, I have actually taken to court some of the perpetrators who have come after me and my family online. And I said to the judge, I'm very lucky to be able to have the resources to do so because so many online victims do not. And it was great to actually have it played out and make sure that the person who was putting out a lot of the online harassment of me and my family members, that he had to face the music. So again, I was very lucky to do so. I have found other victims in the same sphere. We had started a group called Operation Bullyproof, and we're here to protect both adults and minors online because this is going to be an ongoing problem. And we don't really have a solution yet. We have to stop protecting all the social media companies and allow to pierce, victims like myself and my family members to be able to do something about this rather than spend lots of money in courts. But, this should be something to be looked at by Congress, we hope.
And I just wondered, given that you are of Chinese heritage, how you felt when you heard the Vice President of the United States referring to Chinese peasants twice in one statement in a rather, well, it did sound pejorative, at least when you saw it written down. I don't know if you heard it and thought perhaps that's just the Vice President being, perhaps a little careless. What went through your mind?
No, it was not very statesmanlike. If you want to negotiate with Chinese leaders or any world leaders, you don't resort to language like that. And I hope that J.D. Vance would apologize for saying such a thing, because that is not what statesmen do. We understand that we're in a tariff war. We understand there might be future wars with these countries, but you have to learn to actually speak with other world leaders. And I think that comes with respect, and that comes with language that both sides can hear. If you're going to start off with schoolyard words, well, the other side may just shut down or call you the same or worse. So that's just not a fight that you want to play out on national television, right? Or international television. And it's just not a good basis for any sort of debate. So if both sides, the US and China, wants to get serious about settling things and maybe making trade deals and working together going forward, well, it can't start off with just high school bully words, right? So I think that has to change. And of course, this morning, China retaliated back saying the peasants of the United States. So, you see how silly this is at this point, where there's going to be a war of words, where we've stooped down to a very, very low level that I hope the US can crawl out of, because there's just no good to come from this. And I just wish people would be statesmen again.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have both lived in Hong Kong for at least part of our lives. And one thing I've noticed on social media accounts, people that I am in touch with still in Hong Kong, they're boycotting US goods. And it seems like this is directly linked to how they perceive those comments by J.D. Vance, not just the economics of the tariffs war, but that language. I mean, is that something that you've heard? Have you got anecdotes to suggest that indeed this is a widespread thing and that people will boycott American goods in Hong Kong and in the mainland?
I have heard that Chinese consumers are boycotting U.S.-made goods. I have not heard specifically from Hong Kong. But, ultimately, I wish more and more members of the Trump administration would actually understand China and would understand Hong Kong to know what you're dealing with. When you resort to, just name calling, it just shows that you don't really know who your adversaries are. You don't really know who you're playing with, and you don't know who your audience is. So it would be great if they actually had some on-the-ground experience dealing with citizens, businesses, and even U.S. Business people working in China or Hong Kong. It would be nice to have more of a global perspective. And I just don't feel that this administration knows what they're talking about, because what they're doing is just regurgitating other people. right? And that doesn't, creating that echo chamber doesn't really help you understand the real situation at hand. It just gives you more and more noise in the TV, radio, newspaper world. So I don't doubt that there's going to be, from both sides, people trying to band each other. But, you and I know that that's not how the global economy works, right? We know that the Nike sneakers that we buy here, even though they're supposedly from Vietnam, well, that's a Chinese company that owns that factory in Vietnam. So I think, those things need to kind of be dissected a lot more. It can't just be, I need to buy everything from made in America or made in this country or that country, because the world economy does not work that way. And our packaging comes from all around the world, right? So, it's just one of those things where it becomes moot point when you actually understand what you're talking about. And that's what I would like Team Trump to understand a lot more, is the totality of what they're doing here. And name calling, bad look, guys.
Yeah, and I guess someone has been having a bit of fun, poking some fun at America with those memes and those AI-generated videos of people in what look like sweatshops that you would see, or large factory floors that you would see perhaps more typically in places like Vietnam, where they have production lines that look like that, but with Americans superimposed in their places. I mean, I don't think very many Americans want to be stitching sneakers together on a production line, do they?
No, and quite honestly, American kids are not going to be pattern makers. They're not going to be sewing Levi's jeans. That is just not how they were brought up. And I hate to say it that way, because I just don't see my own kids doing it. And I don't know what the path forward is going to look like in that respect. What we do see is that, I think at the end of the rainbow here, we're going to see that we actually need to coexist together. A lot of these countries, whether it's manufacturing companies or consumer countries, we do need to find that medium. What we're now seeing coming out of the Trump administration is that they're now giving exemptions for certain tariffs, because at some point they realize, oh, we do need semiconductors. Oh, maybe we do need, computers and phones and electronics, and we can't produce those yet. So you're starting to see the cracks of the Trump tariff. And I wonder if it was really thought out, because you don't make a big, proclaim a big statement like we're going to tariff everybody and then say, whoops, we're going to just exempt this, that, and the other because we still need it here in the US. So it looks a little bit sloppy from my point of view, but I hope we do get it right, because look, Americans are consumers. We're the largest consumer base. We need stuff. We need stuff to survive our day-to-day lives. So I think Trump is understanding that, but I wonder why he understood that, weeks after he announced tariffs on everybody.
Well, this is why we like speaking to you, Angie, because you give both sides of the story, and you do raise some important questions. Just lastly, and looping back to what we were talking about at the beginning about the Gulf of America, I've just been sent a poll done admittedly in February that says the vast majority of people in Florida are opposed to the idea of the Gulf of America being named as such, and they want it to stay Gulf of Mexico. Just lastly, maybe you could tell us, are people in Florida on the whole quite conservative and resistant to change? What would you read into the fact that the majority of people, 58%, don't support a name change?
Yeah, I don't know about these polls. I do polls myself, and I will say I could buy polls whenever I need to, and poll people the way I need to get the results that I want. Ultimately, I don't think a lot of Floridians are going to be too bothered by this name change. I wouldn't understand why Americans wouldn't want the Gulf of America to reflect them. I think that's a great thing, like the American flag, to have flying on your signage all over the highways and on maps and textbooks. I think it's a good thing. Now, maybe they don't enjoy change. Maybe they enjoy Gulf of Mexico, but there's really no reasoning for it. Ultimately, this is a good day and definitely a good way forward for America. It might just take some getting used to.
Okay, that poll was in the Florida Phoenix, in case you want to check it out. And just lastly, Angie, if I say Gulf of Mexico on this channel, or you hear me say it anywhere else, will you be sending me a sternly worded letter?
No, I might just correct you. The same way I still use Twitter instead of X, I may just say, look, this is the new lingo now. We should probably get on it, right? But I still say Twitter all the time. And it's just a matter of getting used to things. It's going to take some time. But, I promise you, Tom, in a few years, we're not even going to remember the Gulf of Mexico. We're only going to be saying the Gulf of America.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Angie Wong, Republican committee member in Florida. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.